Before God builds anything that lasts, He first dismantles what cannot support your purpose. Most Christians have been taught that when God is working, life should become easier. But that's not what Scripture shows. In fact, one of the clearest signs that God is preparing someone for a greater purpose is that everything they trusted begins to fall apart first. Here's the part almost no one talks about. Sometimes what feels like the enemy attacking you is actually God's own hand removing the foundation that could never carry your calling. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why God allows seasons that look like loss, why He breaks before He builds, and how the story of the potter and the clay reveals whether your current pain is destruction or preparation. And there's one biblical pattern almost every believer misses. Once you see it, you'll never look at your breaking season the same way again. And nowhere is this pattern clearer than in the story God showed the prophet Jeremiah. Consider the account in Jeremiah 18, where the prophet is told to go down to the potter's house and watch him work. The potter is shaping a vessel on the wheel, and the clay is marred in his hands. It doesn't come out the way he intended. So he doesn't discard it. He takes the same clay, presses it back down, and starts forming it again into another vessel, shaping it as seemed best to him. That single image carries the entire logic of this season. The marring wasn't the end of the material. It was the reason the potter's hands went back to work. What looked like failure from the clay's position was, from the potter's hands, simply the next necessary step toward the actual shape being intended all along. But don't miss what happens next, because Jeremiah's story isn't really about clay. It's about what God does when He refuses to give up on someone He has chosen. Here's what's actually at risk if you only trust a version of God's work that looks gentle. You start believing that anything painful must mean you did something wrong, or that God has stepped back, or that the plan has failed. You interpret the pressure as abandonment instead of as involvement. And that interpretation costs you the ability to recognize that the hand pressing the clay back down is the same hand that intends to lift it back up. That pressure and presence are not opposites in this process, they're often the same thing. Think about what breaking actually looks like once it moves out of metaphor and into an ordinary week. It looks like waking up without the certainty you used to carry about your own direction. It looks like a plan you built your identity around, quietly falling apart, piece by piece, with no clear replacement in sight. It looks like realizing that something you leaned on, a relationship, a title, an image of yourself as someone who always holds it together, was never actually load-bearing, and now that it's gone, you're left standing in the wreckage of what you thought was solid ground. It also looks like a kind of stripping down that has nothing to do with punishment. Old comforts stop comforting. Old distractions stop distracting. Things that used to numb the discomfort of an unresolved life suddenly feel hollow, almost unbearable, as if something in you has lost the ability to pretend they were ever enough. That's not a malfunction. That's often the first sign that something in you is being cleared out on purpose, to make room for what's coming next. And if you think this pattern ended with Jeremiah, the next person God allowed to be broken will probably surprise you. Job's story is one of the clearest pictures in Scripture of breaking that precedes building, and it's worth sitting with honestly, instead of rushing to the ending everyone already knows. Job lost his possessions, his children, and his health, in that order, without explanation offered to him in the moment. For most of the book, he isn't told why. He sits in ashes, scraping his skin, surrounded by friends offering explanations that mostly make things worse. It's only in the final chapters that any kind of restoration appears, and even then, Job 42:10 records that it was after Job had prayed for his friends that the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice what he had before. Notice the order again. The breaking came first, without a visible reason attached to it. The restoration came after, and it came in a form larger than what had existed before the loss. This matters because it means the explanation you might be waiting for, the reason this is happening, the justification that would make the pain make sense, was never promised to arrive before the process finishes. Sometimes it arrives after. Sometimes it never fully arrives in the way you expected, and what arrives instead is simply the built thing itself, standing where the ruin used to be. But before we leave this season of brokenness, King David reveals something equally important. Psalm 34:18 says something that matters a great deal in the middle of a season like this. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Read that carefully. It doesn't say the Lord is close after the brokenness ends. It says He's close to the brokenhearted, present in the exact condition, not just in its aftermath. The crushing isn't proof of distance. In this verse, it's the specific place where nearness is promised, which reframes the entire experience of breaking from something that separates you from God into something that, strangely, positions you closer to Him than you might have been while everything still looked fine. And perhaps no one experienced this pattern more personally than Peter, because unlike Job, Peter watched his own failure happen in real time. There's a story about Peter that carries this same shape, and it's easy to skip past because the ending is so familiar. After denying he even knew Jesus 3 separate times, on the night it mattered most, Peter doesn't get a quiet pass back into leadership. He gets a direct, repeated confrontation. In John 21, after the resurrection, Jesus asks him the same question 3 times. Do you love me? Matching the number of denials almost exactly. And each time Peter answers, Jesus responds with an instruction. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. The breaking wasn't skipped over on the way to restoration. It was addressed directly, 3 times, before the rebuilding of Peter's role was handed back to him. What looks like Jesus rubbing salt into a wound is closer to the opposite. He's making sure the broken part gets fully repaired instead of just covered over, because a covered wound and a healed one behave very differently under pressure later. Here's what almost everyone overlooks. Peter wasn't simply forgiven, he was rebuilt, and that changes everything. Hosea 6:1 puts language directly onto what this process feels like from the inside. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but He will heal us. He has injured us, but He will bind up our wounds. That verse doesn't soften the tearing to make it more comfortable to read. It names it plainly, and then places the healing immediately after it, in the same breath, as though the two are part of one continuous motion, rather than 2 separate events separated by an uncertain gap. The tearing isn't evidence that healing was cancelled. In this verse, it's presented as the very thing healing follows. It helps to understand what breaking is actually doing structurally, instead of only enduring it emotionally. A building can't go up straight on a foundation that's already compromised, cracked in places no one bothered to check because the surface still looked fine. Sometimes the only way to build something that holds is to remove what was already failing underneath, even if removing it means the whole structure looks worse before it looks better. The breaking season you're in might not be undoing something that was working. It might be exposing something that was never actually working, no matter how solid it appeared from the outside. Think about what it would mean to build something new directly on top of an old foundation that was already cracked, just because tearing it out looked too disruptive, too painful, too visible to other people watching. The new structure would eventually inherit every weakness the old one had, just hidden beneath fresh material for a while. Breaking removes that risk. It's disruptive, often humiliating, frequently mistaken for God pulling away, but it creates the only kind of clean foundation that whatever gets built next can actually stand on without repeating the same collapse later. Now we're arriving at the part that explains why all of these stories follow the exact same pattern. Here's something worth being honest about. Breaking rarely happens on a schedule you'd choose. It tends to arrive in the exact season you were finally starting to feel stable, right when a plan was gaining traction, right when things had started to look like they were finally coming together. That timing feels almost cruel, until you consider that a foundation can only be properly inspected and replaced, while there's enough already built to reveal where the cracks actually are. God rarely breaks an empty field. He breaks what's already standing, because that's the only way to find out what wasn't going to hold the next stage of weight. 2 Corinthians 12:9 records something Paul was told directly after pleading 3 times for a source of suffering to be removed from his life. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul doesn't report that the difficulty vanished after he asked. He reports the opposite. The difficulty stayed, but something about how power operates through weakness was revealed instead. That's not a comfortable answer. It's an honest one. It suggests that some breaking isn't meant to be removed as much as it's meant to relocate where your strength actually comes from, shifting it away from your own capacity and towards something that doesn't run out the way your own capacity eventually does. But before you assume every painful season comes from God, there's one important distinction you need to understand. This is where it's worth naming a common misunderstanding, because it's easy to fall into without noticing. Breaking that comes from God is not the same thing as damage you're causing yourself out of self-punishment or despair. There's a difference between a season that's difficult because something necessary is being dismantled on purpose, and a season that's difficult because you've stopped taking care of yourself, isolated from anyone who could help, and started treating your own suffering as proof of some deserved punishment. The first kind of breaking, however painful, is still moving somewhere. The second kind can quietly become its own trap, unrelated to any building that follows. If you're unsure which one you're in, a fair question is whether there's still movement underneath the pain, some evidence, even small, that something is shifting, or whether the pain has become static, going nowhere, feeding only on itself. There's a version of this worth naming specifically because it's common and rarely talked about honestly. Breaking while still performing strength for everyone watching. Showing up composed at work, steady at family gatherings, calm in ordinary conversations, while the actual dismantling is happening somewhere underneath, completely invisible to anyone standing nearby. That performance isn't dishonest by itself. Sometimes it's simply what functioning requires, while something larger is being taken apart out of view. But it's worth checking in honestly about whether the performance has quietly become a way of avoiding the breaking altogether, rather than just a container that holds you steady while it happens. Think about what's already been broken in you, even if the building hasn't started yet, even if nothing has visibly replaced what was removed. Maybe it's the belief that you had to control every outcome to be safe. Maybe it's a version of your identity that depended entirely on other people's approval to feel stable. Maybe it's simply the assumption that stability meant nothing painful was allowed to happen to you. None of these look like construction yet. They look like empty space where something used to stand, and empty space, uncomfortable as it is often the exact condition something new requires before it can be placed there at all. It's also worth being honest about how uneven this process usually feels while it's happening. Breaking rarely completes itself in one clean motion. There are days that feel like real clarity, followed by weeks that feel like the ground has opened up all over again, in a place you thought was already settled. That unevenness isn't proof the process has failed. Job's own account includes long stretches where nothing changes, where his condition doesn't improve, where his friends' arguments only make the isolation worse, before any restoration appears anywhere in the text. The breaking recorded across that book wasn't a short, contained event. It was an extended process that included real stagnation, absorbed without the story ending there. That's likely closer to what your own breaking season looks like too, even if it doesn't match the version you originally expected to experience. If you're in a season right now that feels like nothing but loss, no clear next step, no visible plan, no proof that anything good is actually coming from this, consider that this might be exactly what necessary breaking looks like while it's still underway. Job wasn't shown the reason while he was sitting in it. Peter wasn't given his role back before the confrontation happened. Paul didn't get the thorn removed before he understood what the weakness was for. In each case, the building came after the breaking was allowed to finish doing its work completely, not around it and not instead of it. And this brings us to the question every believer eventually has to answer for themselves. So ask yourself honestly, is there something in you right now that finally feels light enough to fall away? An old belief, an old image of yourself, an old foundation you've quietly known for a while wasn't going to hold. That falling away might not be loss the way it feels right now. It might be the exact clearing this season requires before anything new has room to stand. If this spoke to where you are right now, stay. There's more waiting for you here. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, because what's being broken in you right now isn't the end of the story. It's the ground being cleared for what he's about to build.